Around 7,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptian civilization emerged. Although it may seem difficult to imagine, Egypt had the same kinds of laws and regulations as exist today. The fact that they had heaps of amputated limbs, heads and phalluses, however, showed how harsh and icy their justice system could be, contradicting their compassionate principles of granting equal rights to women and people of all socio-economic strata. The justice system. Around 2950 BC, also known as the start of the Old Monarchy, King Menes united the upper and lower kingdoms, and this is when Egypt's first laws were established. Local laws were a matter of private concern in ancient and medieval Egypt. Similar to how each of the 7 kingdoms in Game of Thrones had its army, the local leaders in charge of maintaining order had their guards. The underworld's religious court, where the departed is tried in front of Osiris for his actions, and a civil court, where the community's punishment was applied, were the 2 sorts of prosecution for transgressing moral standards. The vizier, the pharaoh's right hand, presided over the majority of judicial proceedings. Depending on the seriousness of the offences, criminal justice required a hierarchy in the legal system. Only the pharaoh could judge the most severe offenders. Frequently, the vizier would lead the inquiry and refer the case to pharaoh for final determination. The pharaoh occasionally appointed a special commission with full power to render judgment. Mutilation and flogging were frequently employed to punish perpetrators of smaller offences, while execution and penal servitude were used as punishment for significant crimes. Community leaders served as the kenbet, or local court, which heard the cases and rendered verdicts on guilt and innocence. If we exclude the pharaoh, the vizier, who presided over the judgate or imperial court, was the ultimate supreme judge. Lower magistrates, however, handled the majority of court matters. The court could be held practically anywhere, including the market or on the street, even though every city had an administrative structure known as the Judgment Hall. The people trusted the priests of Amun to conduct a fair trial and render the appropriate judgment. Therefore, there were no attorneys present and no opportunity for appeals. This was a decision made by a bureau. Priests would consult with their god to reach a decision rather than analyzing the available information and witness testimony. You can probably appreciate how equitable this system has to be. During the Middle Kingdom, which was founded about the 20th century BC, the judiciary evolved into a more logical and rational template for modern society. Courts were presided over by qualified judges, and the judicial system worked according to cause and reason. The first professional police force, which upheld the law, detained offenders, and gave testimony in court, was also established at this time. The concept of a centralized police force was later adopted by Egypt with the advent of the New Kingdom and originated with its Nubian allies, the Medjay. These more capable and well-organized police officers have support staff as well as dogs or baboons to help them apprehend thieves. They took special satisfaction in protecting the pharaohs of Egypt and upholding the principle that neither the wealthy nor the impoverished were exempt from the rule of law. Different punishments. Egyptian law was commendable in its support of fundamental human rights, even though criminal violators might face harsh and, in our eyes, cruel punishment. For instance, the pharaoh Bokharis supported individual liberties, prohibited debtors' prisons, and altered the laws governing property transfers. Egyptian laws served as a major source of inspiration for the Greek Solon's reforms to Athens' penal code. In ancient Egypt, there were 2 different kinds of crimes: those committed against the community, such as murder, adultery, and theft of personal property, and those committed against the state, like bribery, treason, theft of public property, and any offenses against religious organizations. Citizens who committed crimes may expect to face a variety of penalties, including property seizure, beatings, mutilations, and even execution without a proper funeral. Death without a decent burial was seen as the worst possible outcome, since the Egyptians held that a proper burial was a prerequisite for achieving the afterlife. Egypt's zero-tolerance approach to corruption was one of the factors that let it endure as a civilization for so long. Bribery was primarily one of the most severe administrative offenses committed by the state. By being fired from their position and having a farmer's monument degraded, they received their punishment. In contrast, stealing someone else's property could result in a fine of up to 2 or 3 times the value of the items taken, and stealing something from the government could result in a punishment of up to 180 times the value of the items taken. After a complete confession, the accused would be told to give back the items that were taken. However, their punishment did not finish there because they beat him as well. Then the guilty were given 100 handshakes before being made to swear an oath. To disgrace the offender and ensure they never do it again, the entire penalty would be carried out in public. And if they did, repeat offenders would be cast into the river where they would become the crocodile's delectable feast. According to the Ani inscriptions, the Bulaq Papyrus and the Lead Papyrus, ancient Egypt detested adultery and thought it was punished by death if the spouse of the adulterer filed a complaint. The accused would ask for death by immolation as a penalty if found guilty of adultery, because the alternative was having their genitalia cut off. Sexual assault was regarded as a similarly horrible and repugnant crime. The moral position of the ancient Egyptians on sexual offences was that harassment and sexual assault were more serious offences. The Moral Papyrus, which is now housed in the British Museum, states that anyone who hurt a woman would face harsh punishment. The sanctity of life was cherished by the ancient Egyptians. To avoid violating sacredness, they only utilized the death penalty. This is the reason why manslaughter and murder are both punishable by death. Although this was rather merciful for ancient times, it was necessary to set a precedent to protect the death penalty's non-violation. Intentional murder was punishable by the death sentence, which sometimes even included psychological punishments that were thought to be harsher than execution. For instance, a son or daughter who murders one of its parents would simply be burned alive on a pyre. However, when the father killed a son or daughter, the killer's body was bound to the victim's corpse for 3 days until it began to decompose, all the while being guarded. Grave robbing was viewed as a serious sin. Thus, the accused would get the death penalty if proven guilty. Anyone who committed a murder was used as a warning to anyone who made a threat to kill someone else. For individuals who'd been given the death penalty by the people, martyrdom was a blessing. No specific punishment existed for involuntary manslaughter, since the perpetrator refused to enter his home until he atoned for his guilt, offered sacrifices, asked the victim's family for forgiveness, and paid the proper restitution. Whoever covered up the murder or had knowledge of the act was still subject to punishment because they would have to stand before judges and, if found guilty, would be forced to commit suicide. If a person knowingly kills an animal that has religious value, they'll be put to death. Other offences that were reserved for the harshest punishment included treason and betrayal. They had the greatest contempt for betrayal, and it nearly invariably resulted in certain death. The likelihood that the perpetrator would be executed if found guilty increased with how close they were to the pharaoh. There were also no grave advantages or rights for the penalized, just like in the majority of other cases of crimes of this nature. Grave robbing was viewed as the worst sin in ancient Egypt, therefore being caught meant either becoming crocodile food or being killed by being impaled. There was no escaping death if the tomb belonged to a royal personage like a king, queen, or prince. Other times, though, the laws are exempt and just cut off the offender's hands. Issues with the system. Ancient Egypt, in contrast to the modern world, held that a suspect was guilty unless proven innocent, which made life extremely difficult for anyone who was accused of any crime. You wouldn't believe it, but even after they were found innocent, which wasn't often, especially in earlier kingdoms, it never ended. Additionally, the witnesses were also included in the ordeal and were subjected to rigorous punishments to ensure that they gave accurate testimony. Even if someone was ultimately proven innocent after being charged with a crime, their name was still listed as a suspect. Therefore, it appears that public humiliation served as just as effective a deterrence as any other punishment. Even if one were totally cleared of any wrongdoing, they would still be regarded as former suspects in their society. In addition to dishonoring an innocent person, a false accusation was regarded as a serious felony because it called into question the effectiveness of the law. The goddess Maat, who represents justice, virtue, and wisdom, was largely regarded as deriving her divinity from which the law was drawn. The authorities were not interested in having people argue whether a system that claimed divine origin was right or evil if an innocent person could be punished by it. Anyone who intentionally and deliberately lied to the court about a crime could anticipate receiving any type of punishment, including amputation or drowning to death. That's it for today's video. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment on what video you want to watch next. And if you've enjoyed the video, make sure to watch this video to learn more about the worst Chinese punishment methods.